Today is March 29th, 2010. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University Library, and we're conducting an oral history project featuring the Centennial Farm Families of Oklahoma. And today we're in Edmond with Miss Susan Bize.
Yes.
And we're going to learn a little bit about the Nordstrom Farm. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you.
Let's start by having you tell us how your family came to own the property initially.
Okay, my great-grandfather, Gustav Nordstrom, had immigrated from Sweden a couple years prior to the run of 1889, and he was living up in Illinois. And when he heard about the run, he thought this would be a great opportunity. He was a farmer by trade in Sweden, and when he came here, he went to Purcell on the train and then took the train north from Purcell to participate in the run. He got off the train at the Edmond depot and ran due west till he found the creek that is the perimeter of the property and decided this would be perfect for farming. Plus he'd also have some wild game, hopefully. So he found a flag in the center and decided this was his, so he stayed there. And he actually called his brother, Charlie, who was living still in Illinois, to come down, and they purchased acreage just east of here. So then they had the 320 to farm. And then my future great-grandmother came separately with her brother, and she homesteaded 160 acres west of here with her brother with the contiguous property of 160 acres. And they farmed that for, I guess, the requisite 5 years to get clear title, and went to Guthrie, got their title to the property, and continued farming. Then I guess it was about 8 years after the original 1889 homestead days, and Gustav and his future bride, Clara Blades, married. And I didn't realize it, but apparently you had to give up your claim as a married woman, because I found in the deed records that she transferred title to him, not as joint tenants, but as his ownership. So then they had and she switched her property with her brother, so they had the 320, and for a while they actually farmed 640 acres around here. And they lived here till they passed away. She passed away I guess he passed away in 43. She passed away in 53. And my grandmother was born here, and my mother was actually born here too. Stayed in the family, and it was actually rented out from the 50s till my parents moved here in 82.
Was your mother the only child?
Yes. Yes. And my great-grandparents had 3, my grandmother and her sister, and then a son who was her sibling who was about 7 years younger.
And they chose not to stay with
They left, I guess the son moved to western Oklahoma. The younger daughter, my grandmother was the oldest, moved to Texas. She married a guy in Texas and went there, so my grandmother stayed here. And continued to work with the parents here.
Well, what were some of the early things that they farmed?
They did oats, I believe, and I actually have the transcript that Gustav did for I guess it was the Edmond Historical Society. And he said their first crop was kaffir corn, I'm not sure what that is, and potatoes and oats. So that was, and then they bought chickens, and apparently they had hogs and had livestock and a blacksmith shop. I know they also had a vineyard, because Gustav made his own wine. He liked to have that on occasion. And they had an orchard in the back. So they were pretty self-sufficient.
Did they have to work outside the farm?
No, they worked on the farm, totally.
Didn't have to have supplemental income from other sources?
Nope. They were totally self-sufficient.
Did they have education, higher education of anything?
No, I don't believe they ever had any schooling beyond. Now, Gustav, when he came here, was 26. So he had gone through these schools in Sweden, had done his military service before he moved here. Clara, I don't know if she had anything beyond the requisite education. She came from Kansas. Now, my grandmother, Myrtle, the oldest daughter, actually was educated at the normal school, which is now part of UCO. And apparently, Gustav, the original building that was built on the UCO campus was Old North. And that was built, I guess, shortly after 1889. And Gustav had his binoculars and would stand on the hill and look to see on Old North the time of day so he could set his clocks.
Interesting.
But it's kind of fun because then my dad went to the same, what was Central State, and then I got to teach there. So we got to continue kind of the family tradition.
And where did they go to elementary school, your grandmother and her siblings?
She went to, my grandmother went to Higbee, which I believe is torn down.
And that would have been how far from?
That would have,
roughly?
well, she actually rode a horse there, so I'm not sure how far. That would have been a few miles probably.
Well, the reason I asked, we passed a territorial school on the
Right.
way in, so I wondered.
And that, unfortunately, was not the one she attended.
It's not too
It would
far
have been
from here,
fun. Yeah, because I actually worked on the committee that was putting that back together.
Well, talk a little bit about what you know of the buildings that were on their, once they
Let
were.
me show you something. Just one second. I'll put that turn over. Here is a picture I found of the farmhouse and the outbuildings with the barn. And we had originally, and Mom had actually created a graph to show you.
Okay.
Where we have the farmhouse, the upper story, and then the chicken coop, blacksmith shop, barn,
Milk house.
milk house,
So
and of
that's
course the outdoor toilets, his and hers.
They actually had two, huh?
They had two, his and hers.
And they had a chicken house and a potato bin. And I'm assuming the cellar was.
Underneath the house. Right, and that's where they stored the meat and the preserves and that sort of thing. That was their refrigeration.
Blacksmith, so they were gifted with being able to do repairs themselves.
Yes, they did everything.
Interesting the distance, the men's.
I thought that was kind of cute. The men had to go further than the women.
Quite a bit further from the house itself, but maybe not from where they were doing most of their daily work.
Exactly. Yeah, and then some of the stories that they had, Mom had typed up, saying that Grandpa, which Gustav's first house was a dugout, and it was on the west side of the creek near a clump of trees at the base of a small knoll. And he then made a lean-to and used the creek for washing and bathing. And then town, it says, was 3 miles across the prairie on foot. So the horse was one of the first items they actually purchased. And I remember Clara did sell eggs. So they did sell out of the farm the eggs for additional revenue. And said that fish and game were very plentiful. And one of the things I thought was kind of interesting was how they did the harvest, because this was all, the vegetation. In fact, now we do have hay. Some of the hay is beginning to come back. So we have a friend who comes out and helps us bale and do that. But the harvest, apparently Gustav could figure out how many bushels per acre by looking at one of the heads. And if it had 39 grains, that would be 39 bushels per acre, which I guess was fairly accurate. But my mother actually used to go out and help with the harvest, and she thought that was so fun because she could go out and take water to the guys when they were out working in the field. And then they had a bell and a pole that they would ring, and of course the women were all in cooking, and I guess it took most of the morning to cook for the lunch meal, and then the guys would come in at the appropriate time to do that. And one of the things, maybe I could read you a little bit of that.
Sure.
Would that be good?
If you want.
Or do you have some more questions on it?
Okay.
One of the things that she said that at lunchtime, all the women were in the kitchen, and they had seats under the trees in the back, although most of the trees, unfortunately, are now gone. The ice has gotten rid of a lot of them. And they'd have wash basins hanging from the limbs and a roll of towels so that they could wash up. Had radishes, carrots, fried chicken, and fresh baked bread and hot pies. So they had some pretty heavy lunches, but they were doing a lot of work. I think that's about the extent of that.
So I noticed in this picture they had a windmill for their water.
Yes, and actually that was just to the left. The original well is not producing anymore, so actually we are on a well, but it's a few feet in from the original. But that's where the windmill was for the original well.
Do you have any recollection of when electricity came to the farm?
No, I actually don't know that.
Well, do you know when the house, or roughly when this particular house was built?
That was probably built in the early, like 1901. Originally, it was just one room, and then they expanded on and doubled it, and then they added the upstairs when the kids came along. So my grandmother was born in 98, so that would be in the late, probably early 1900s when they built the upper story.
And do you remember spending any time in the house yourself?
No, unfortunately, I was a little too young at that point. I do remember just that it seemed a lot bigger than it was when it was torn down probably in the late 60s because the tenants had pretty much destroyed it. But it was a lot smaller than I remembered as a child. But the thing that I remember about it too is it was very cool. Probably because it's up on the hill and the wind is pretty heavy around here. And of course it had the front porch and then the doors and windows that could be opened and have a nice breeze through. So it always seemed kind of cool. And the cellar was definitely cool. Very kind of damp and cool for preserving everything.
They had a big garden and then kept it full, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Did your mother can much too? I mean, did that?
Yes, and in fact, when I was a little girl, my grandmother and my mother and I were all canning. That was a tradition that we carried through, even when my grandmother moved off the farm when she got older and after my mother was born. My mother was an only child, so we have a very small family, and lived in Edmond. And at that point, I remember when I was a little girl, she would still carry the tradition of the canning and come out to the farm and get the orchard. I guess the only thing left of the orchard is the one poor pear tree, which has only 2 branches left now.
Well, take us through the canning process.
Okay, my complaint about it was always conducted in the summer when it was really hot. And the thing I remember the most was boiling everything. So you'd have big tubs of various, probably I think it was mainly pears and I don't remember all other, because grapes I don't remember, but pears I remember a lot of, and peaches. Those were the main things that we were canning. And melting the wax and getting it just right so that the wax would sit on those little mason jars that you could screw them on, and without the wax getting too much and coming over and closing the jars. And most of my task was stirring. I was not, because I was about probably 5 at the time, so I was not proficient enough to do any of the actual canning other than stirring the pots and making sure everything was in order. But you'd have to sterilize all the cans first and before you could boil the fruits and put them in.
What other traditions do you remember them showing you in your childhood?
The one that, and actually this wasn't one that I participated in, but my mother did, was making hats and purses from straw. And they would take the leftover straw from the field and soak it and braid it into hats that they actually wore. So I still have one that Mom made when she was a teenager with my grandmother, or great-grandmother. But that, and the thing I remember too is all the clothes were handmade. Sometimes out of feed sacks, or when they got more material, they would make all their clothes out of that. And so my grandmother was always sewing. But pretty much everyone in the family except me was a great cook. I have lost that gene somehow. But I remember my grandmother always cooking, and then my mom was also a very good cook.
You mentioned homemade bread.
Oh, yes. Yeah, everything was done, of course, from scratch. And then the quilts, you can see some quilts over there that my grandmother made, but that was something that they always liked. And my mother talked about, since they didn't have central heat when she was young, that you would sleep in the bed and they'd heat up a brick and put in the bottom of the bed to keep it warm, and then pile quilts on top of you to stay warm.
Made it cold getting dressed for school in the
That's what I can't imagine. And I now see why they didn't shower or bathe that frequently, because it would be really cold in the winter.
Well, how did they do that when they did shower and bathe?
Just your once a week before you go to Sunday service, which is when they would dress up, they would heat on the stove the big kettles of water, pour it into a tub, and take the lye soap. And actually, there's some soapberry trees by the creek, and so they were able to use those for soap in the early days.
I'm not familiar with that tree.
Yeah, it has little round berries, and when you squish them up, they're kind of a soapy, cleansing texture. They're literally soap berries. It's kind of strange.
Well, going back to the food,
Yeah.
what are some foods that you remember or you can recall your mother talking about?
Everything was fried. That's the thing that I remember. It was, and I guess because the ovens were pretty much used for bread and pies, so all the meats were fried. Fish was always fried. And I remember potatoes were a real pain because you had to, of course, boil them and peel them and mash them. And the thing I remember most is how much hard work it was to make a meal, because they had no conveniences. And the women had to be pretty strong to do that. And, of course, churning the butter and everything. And I remember Mom talking about going into the chicken house to get the eggs. And, of course, the chickens weren't very pleased about her coming in, taking their eggs. But everything was very fresh but very labor-intensive.
And for their meat, how did they?
They butchered, they had hogs and chickens, and when the chickens got too old, they became food. But apparently once a year they'd have a big butchering of the hogs. And Mom talked about they would cure the meat by smoking it and then actually hanging it in the house from the rafters to let it dry and cure. And she talked about sometimes that Gustav would go by and just cut off a little slice for a snack.
Do you remember them discussing their first tractor?
No, because most of the discussion I heard from my grandmother was the plow with the horse and walking behind that. And I can't imagine how much work that was. And I did find out, or found out in the barn, a scythe that Gustav had made just from the wood and metal that he had been forged. Apparently Charlie was the one who was really good with metal and doing the blacksmithing. That was his brother, and he never married, so he lived with him his whole life. And he was also the one who took care of the animals. So Gustav was better at the farming, and he was in charge of all the crops and that sort of thing. So they had a little division of labor, and then of course Clara was in the house doing all the home maintenance and cooking.
And to take their products to market, did they go to the city or to Edmond?
To Edmond. Everything was in Edmond, and apparently a road was developed not long after that, just a dirt road, which is right down there. Edmond Road was the road that they used to take everything.
And how often would they go into town?
I think they went in once a week for church service, and that was really the only time they would go in, or if they needed to buy anything, some fabric and that sort of thing.
Did they ever do cotton?
No, they didn't.
Was it?
I'm not sure where the cotton was actually grown.
It may not have been in this.
I don't think it was around this part because I don't think the climate was. The soil is not that great right here because it's clay. So it's hard to grow a lot. In fact, my other great-grandfather, which was my mother's father's father, homesteaded also. And his area could only grow turnips. So that they didn't keep that property for the full time. But with the creek, it had a lot more potential here. But again, it was pretty much hay and wheat and that sort of thing.
And it started out as 160 and then went up to 6 something and then
640.
And what
right?
is it currently?
60.
And the other is.
Yeah, in fact, the addition to the right was sold probably in the mid-70s. And then the addition to the west of us was sold in the late 70s, early 80s. And then Mom and Dad kept the 60 in the middle.
So you're surrounded by
Development?
Exactly, exactly. And that's the problem with the creek, because the creek used to be high enough that Mom told stories about ice skating on it in the winter. And of course they fished all the time. And now it's a few inches deep because of all the development is pretty much dammed up the creek and there's not much left. But there's enough so that we have still the wild turkey and the deer.
any ponds?
No, no, just
They didn't have any made during their.
no. They just used the creek for that.
Did they participate in any of the soil conservation efforts early on?
I'm not sure. I know that they made it through the Depression time and the without a problem. So I guess that they were doing enough rotation of the crops. And since Gustav had grown up in a farming community in Sweden, I think he was pretty aware. And he did like the Farmer's Almanac. That was one of his little books that he thoroughly believed it would plant by those.
When it says plant and harvest, when it says harvest.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, he did.
Well, what were some of the holidays like?
Apparently, and unfortunately, all I knew was my great-grandmother, because Gustav was gone. But apparently they were just a family oriented. They didn't have, and since we had somewhat of a small family, but he did try and keep some of the Swedish traditions alive. So they would have the Christmas tree and a lot of home-baked cookies and treats and that sort of thing. But he was, I guess both of them were pretty serious people. And they farmed most of the time. I remember when they were probably in their 60s, and they lived till their mid-80s, that Gustav was getting tired of farming and getting kind of old. And Clara apparently said, well, if you're going to retire, I am too, and I'm not cooking anymore. So I'm not sure that that really worked. They kind of continued until they were unable to do anything.
Well, I noticed on this diagram that you showed that there's a flagpole.
Yes, there was a flagpole in front. Unfortunately, that's gone too, but he was very patriotic. When he got his citizenship, he renounced his Swedish citizenship, and he was definitely going to be
Would
an
he have done
American
that before
citizen.
moving here?
Actually, he did, because on the wall we've got his citizenship papers, and I don't remember the exact date, but I could look and see.
That's okay.
When we go,
I was just curious.
but yes, that would have been because he moved to the U.S. in, let's see, probably 84 or 5, and then studied and got his citizenship probably a couple years later. So he was a citizen by the time he came here.
And it also shows that there's a milk house. Did they have more than one or two dairy?
Just had just a few dairy cows, like
For
2
their
or
own
3 for their
purposes.
own. Yeah.
And I'm assuming they made ice cream.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, so Mom always talked about skimming the cream off the milk
And cottage cheese.
and cottage cheese.
Well, did you participate in like 4-H activities when you
No,
were
I
in-
didn't. And that's what's so strange about moving back here, because I was not really connected to the farm at all. Because I grew up in the 50s in Oklahoma City after pretty much everyone had passed away and the farm was rented out. Most of my activity was coming out, and Dad had cattle out here when we had the original 640. And then after the cattle operation, we just went back to the farming, and he had renters, and the tenants were doing the farming. So until, and when my mom moved out here with my dad in 82, she raised llamas. She wanted to have something, but, and Dad actually still kept some of the farming operation going. But at that point, it was just kind of the back section there. But Mom wanted to have some animals, so she raised llamas.
Although the
And
structure,
that's what the barns are now. Those are llama
I
barns.
was going to say, the structures here, how many of them are still standing in?
None. None, unfortunately. They are all gone. Yeah, and I don't remember anything other than the house, so I think the others had pretty much been torn down by that time.
Any of the vineyard still left?
No, but I'd like to plant one. Apparently it was along the driveway. There's actually out in, one of the barns out there is kind of a storage barn. And there's an old wine press out there that I haven't renovated or brought in. But I'm thinking about that. And in fact, the jug over there by the door is one of the original jugs that Gustav would put his wine in. And we actually have 100-year-old wine that he made in a small container out in the refrigerator that is totally vinegar at this point, since there's no preservatives, but I don't have the heart to throw it out since it's the original. So I will keep it until it totally decays.
Well, once you took over the farm, what type of things have you been doing with it? Anything in particular?
The main thing is trying to get the farming back, because we like to when we first moved here, my husband and I, growing up in cities, had no idea what to do out here. And it was kind of interesting because I figured I would only be here for a short time after the folks passed away, and then we'd do something with it. But now that I've been out here, I really enjoy it and want to preserve it as much as possible. So I've been exploring the barn and seeing what the homemade furniture and all the relics that we have out there and trying to fix those up a little bit. And as I say, getting some crop going again. We now have some hay that it's not much up to horse feed yet, but we're working on it right now. It's cattle feed. And then just enjoying it, because at night the deer come out and they will come up to the back porch. In fact, there's a plant along the patio there that they love to eat. And I'm not sure how Gustav and Clara were ever able to maintain a garden, because they'd have to keep all the deer out, but maybe with the activity that was sufficient to keep the deer away, because they will eat everything. They love the pears in the pear tree. And we also have coyotes that come through on occasion. And, of course, the turkeys that you saw.
That welcomed us today.
Yes. And in the fall, spring is not quite as prevalent because they're chasing each other around. But in the fall, they're usually up on the patio. And they'll be marching around. I try and get them off the patio because I don't like their droppings all over the place, but they tend to come back as soon as I turn my back. But it's so peaceful here. And now it's in Oklahoma City. So you kind of forget about the rest of the world when you're out here. It's just a whole different environment. And it's hard for me to imagine what this was like in Gustav's time. Because now we have the electricity, we have water, sewer, everything that we need. And the idea that you had to go down to the well and get all the water that you wanted. And about the closest we've come is when we did lose electricity for a week. And we had to use the fireplace and sleep by the fire. Of course, we had no water since we're on a well with a pump. So we had to buy bottled water, which is not quite the same.
Well, it seems like you chose wisely, though. The place seems, you're on a knoll.
Yes.
And you can see almost 360.
And he did, because a lot of the areas around here don't have the creek, and I think that's why they were sold. But with the water, it really made a huge difference.
Well, what are some favorite family stories that you remember that you just look back on and think, man, that was a great story?
I think most of the stories were about Gustav, and one of the things that he was, let me think, what would be one of the cute ones? Oh, that Mom said when you got a bee sting, that the way that you would treat that is with tobacco. That Gustav only smoked a pipe on occasion, but he would chew tobacco and spit it on your sting, and that would somehow get rid of it, but apparently it did. But a lot of of course, everything was just a homemade remedy. And I remember salve, whatever salve is, was used for everything. If you got scalded by the hot water or whatever. And she said that Gustav would always dress up for Sunday. The thing that I think that's kind of interesting, the pictures that we've got, is they always look very clean. Everybody's in white. Living out here, how could you be in white with this red clay blowing all over the place? And I guess it was the lye soap or something that bleaching would be a lot easier with white than colors. But I do remember all the pictures of Gustav. He's dressed up. Even if he's out in the field, he looks very nice. He's well kept.
Do you imagine that she pressed his clothes?
Oh, yes. In fact, I've seen the irons, those big flat irons, which are very heavy. but looking presentable whenever you left the property was part of the important part.
Well, I'm assuming in the early days they did their laundry outside.
Yes, in fact, they had a clothesline where they would, which is also something I haven't figured out, because whenever I put clothes out, they come up covered with all the stuff blowing around, but I guess you just get used to that.
Well, maybe the early days had more trees, you said. Maybe that
Maybe
blocked
so. You
some
didn't
of
have
it.
so much soil blowing around. But
Well, what would they do for entertainment?
Gustav whittled. He would actually use his little knife and make little figurines, or they played checkers and read. They both liked to read. So he would read and wrote letters back home, because he had an older brother that stayed in Sweden and took care of his parents. He never actually went back home, but he would write letters frequently. We have some of them in Swedish, which I can't translate.
And then your grandmother, what sort of things would she do for fun?
I think she was
young
mainly
child?
working. I'm not sure she had a lot of free time, because it seemed like she was either sewing or cooking or cleaning or something.
Would she have the pedal
Yes.
sewing machine?
Yes, and there's an older or a younger version of the Singer sewing machine out there with the trestle and that sort of thing.
Well, when she would quilt, would she do those by hand then, or
Oh, yeah.
piece it on the machine and hand quilt, or do it
All hand, all by hand.
Did she have a favorite pattern? Can you tell from what you have left?
I think the rings, whatever that.
The double red ring?
Yes, that seemed to be. But a lot of the quilts are just patches of fabric, just put together in a conglomeration of things.
Everyday use.
Exactly. And that was the idea. It was more of comfort than, because nobody was going to see them but family anyway. So most of the time it was just utilitarian.
Did she make you clothes?
Now my grandmother did, though. Yeah. Even doll clothes. I had handmade doll clothes for all my dolls. And that was kind of nice, since I'm the only grandchild from that, because we have such a small family. So I got my great-grandmother's doll and my grandmother's dolls and everyone's dolls. I have my little collection.
That's nice.
But I guess the thing that is amazing to me is Gustav apparently was always upbeat. Even though the life to me seemed very hard, apparently he was very positive, always happy, always smiling. Even if the crops had a bad year, he knew, hey, that's okay, that's life. You continue on, it'll be better next year. Just a very optimistic fellow.
And he passed that trait on, sounds like.
Definitely to my mom, I try.
So do you have siblings yourself?
I have one brother who's 10 years older, and he's a physician in Oklahoma City.
And then do you have children?
And I don't have any children. He has 2 daughters who each have 2 kids.
So where do you see the next 100 years for this
I'm
place going?
hoping that his daughters will keep it, although one lives in Washington, D.C. and one lives in Dallas, so I'm not so sure how that would work. But then I was in Texas when my folks passed away and moved here. But the daughter who lives in Dallas has 2 boys, one who's now 10 and one who's 7. And they come up here every few months. And I like to take them down to the creek and play around. They got to roll some of the hay bales around and
Get them attached.
get them attached to the property so that maybe they will want to keep it as well.
Why is it important for you to try to keep the land in the family?
That's a good question. There's just that attachment to the land, and I never thought I would have that, because I'm allergic to everything out here. So I have to live on antihistamines about 6 months of the year. And I never thought I would really enjoy living out in the country. But now that I'm out here, there's a pull, there's a bond with the land. And I would really hate to give it up.
And you actually moved in to this house, or when, roughly
In 99.
99, so
My mom passed away at the end of 97, and Dad was a year later. So about 3 months after Dad passed away, I was actually living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And my husband was in Toronto, Canada. And we had been doing a commuter marriage for several years and decided that this would be a good time to do something different. So we moved back here. My brother didn't want to live on the property, but he didn't want to give it up either. So we decided, okay, I'll live here and see how it goes.
So you built the house, or this was their house?
This was the house that was built in 82 when my
theirs.
folks moved out here. Now, my mom designed the house because she always wanted a big open area with lots of windows so she could see.
She made wise choices.
So she designed it, and they moved out here.
And no curtains, or at least
And that
not
was
in
one of
this
her.
room.
That was one of her requirements. She said, "I'm not going to block the view with curtains."
It's nice.
So she did that, and it, as you can see, it's very peaceful, and it's a nice retreat. Even if you've had a bad day, you can come in and just
Well, and to
chill.
just stepping off of it, though, any direction you have the necessities of life.
That's
within
great
5
thing.
minutes or less. Yeah.
Yeah, now when I cook Thanksgiving dinner, I don't have to worry if I forgot something. I just run down to the store, which is 5 minutes away, and get all my necessities.
Well, do you envision having livestock again, or just mainly the hay?
I think just the hay.
Just the hay.
The llamas were cute, though. I really like the llamas. They were sweet. But it is a lot of work. You can't really travel. And I like to be able to get up and go whenever I want.
Well, how long did she have the llamas? Or how?
She had them, let's see, 82 to 95. It was
Oh,
about
wow.
13 years.
She actually sell them?
She started out with one female and one male, and then eventually added some more females and another male, and had probably about 9 at the height. And then she would sell off the babies. And she'd use the wool. She had a friend who would actually take the wool and spin it. So I have a llama hat, llama wool hat, sweater, that sort of thing.
Well, how many farms are you would consider your neighbors in this area? Are there any others, or are you just surrounded by development?
Actually, yes, just north is another one that I think has been in a similar situation. I don't know if it's been in the same family for the entire 120 years, but it's been in the same family at least for another 60, 70 years.
So you're not the lone.
No,
Okay.
no. Most of the others that I remember, though, have been sold off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, across the street there, though, was one of the farms that Charlie purchased, my great-uncle. And the original house that was built in the probably 30s is still there. And Susan is, she is, I guess, the third tenant in that, because Charlie, which was Gustav's brother, built his, which was, let me think now, my grandmother's sibling, the one male Edgar, actually built a house over there, as I recall. It's a stone house, so it was probably built in the 20s, still standing. And she still has about 30 acres. Now that was an original 160, but it was a purchased one, so it wasn't, I don't know who the original homesteader was. But Edgar kept that, that was the sibling, and then sold it to Susan, who is living there now.
What? You had said you were a member of the 89ers? Is that what
Yes, 1889er Society.
you said? Tell us a little bit about that.
That is a group of descendants of the people who made the land run here in the central part of Oklahoma. And they meet about every 3 months, get together, and people brag about their relatives. And they've actually tried to get more activities in the schools. I used to do a little talk at the Edmond Historical Society when they'd have the fourth graders come in and talk about 1889 Day. And some of the other ladies have done that around town. That's a tradition I followed from my mother because she was doing that talk. So when she passed away, I decided, well, I will take on and follow her notes and give the little talk about 89 Day.
Is that a pretty reasonable size group? I mean,
The probably, well, on paper, there are about 100. The people who attend the meetings are about 20. So,
but still, that's
and most of them are pretty old. Mm-hmm. So, and they keep saying how they want to have younger people, but everybody's spread out. And most of the descendants now are throughout the U.S., so not many people are still around that would attend the meetings. But it's kind of fun. That's how I got some of the connections and history of the area.
Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to cover before we sign off?
See if I covered any of the things. Oh, one of the things that I thought was kind of cute that Mom had written about said that in the cellar they would have pickle barrels and crocks of sauerkraut, which he made, and hedge cheese, which I'm not sure that is, as well as the jars of peaches, beans, corn, jellies, jams. And the dried beef would hang from the rafters. And at butchering time, they would raise the pig by ropes and dunk it into a barrel of boiling water, and then shave off the coat with the knives, and hang the hams in the cellar after they were smoked outside. And the outhouse. One for the men was by the blacksmith shop, and it was under a chinaberry tree. And the women's was under a mulberry tree. And said it was a 2-seater equipped with the Montgomery Ward catalog. And on cold winter nights, there was always a little porcelain potty with a lid under your bed. This was kind of cute. The telephone on the wall was 3 short rings and 1 long ring was the Nordstrom ring. And of course, it was a community phone system. And by lifting the receiver very carefully, you could listen in on all the conversations down the line. It said that my great-grandmother loved to do that. That's how she kept up with what was going on in the world. And wood stoves were where they did most of the cooking. And they had a huge black cook stove with spindly legs in the kitchen for warmth and cooking.
It's great that they made these notes.
Yeah, Mom actually is a really good writer, and she had written up she was planning to write something formal, but never got to that, so she did have a lot of notes. And let's see. Oh, and they had a grindstone, of course, near the blacksmith shop. They made their own shoes. Leather goods were home tanned. And I said about the straw hats. Oh, and they got most of their goods from the traveling salesman. That's why they didn't go into town, because the salesman would come by with needles, pens, fabrics, and that sort of thing.
Does she say which one? Does he call it by name?
Mm-mm.
More than one, I'm sure.
Just says the traveling salesman made the rounds. Oh, and then also by the creek, apparently since you could float on it, people would float down the creek. And they had baptisms from some of the churches down in the creek. And she said they would have traveling chautauquas, which I'm not really sure what that is, but some kind of shows that would come through, and they would camp by the creek. And I guess it's like a mini circus without animals. It would just be people, and they would be little acts and magic shows and things like that traveling through the countryside. They would camp down by the creek.
keep going. It sounds good.
So let's see, what else do we have here?
They used every piece of anything, it sounds like.
They
to
did.
make it.
Oh, they had apples, pears, apricots, cherries, and peaches and strawberries. So they did have quite a bit.
Would they have planted those, you think?
Yes. Now the pears, we have, the only tree that we have left is the pear tree, and that is one of the original pear trees, right in the back. And the pears are pretty tough, but if you let them sit out long enough, they sweeten up. But I noticed all the animals love them. The coyotes love them, the deer, the turkeys, even the skunks like them. It's kind of interesting. Let's see. Oh, Gustav and Clara married in, the house, the second story was built in 1897, Mom says. So that was the date on that.
The second story, or the two-story building, or was second?
The second story was
second,
put in.
or was added to it, okay.
Yeah. Because originally, the house apparently was a year after. So that would have been 1890, because they lived by the creek until then.
And I noticed it has a long porch. Do you have any memories or stories about activities occurring on the front porch?
Mainly just watching people go by, I think was the main activity.
Oh, rocking chair or swings? Or
Yes, yes, they did have 2 rockers, his and her rockers on the front. The funny thing is I've never heard of a dog. You know, a lot of people had dogs, but
No,
apparently they
no-
didn't have dogs.
No pets?
No pets, everything were the wild creatures out there.
Not even cats for the two areas?
Yeah, I think they did have cats just to keep the mice away. But they were feral cats. They weren't really pets. And from the interview, yeah, Gustav said that they cut down trees and hauled them to the mill, which was in Edmond. That was one of the first things they had in Edmond, was a little lumber mill. And built the one-room house that was 16 by 20. 2 years later, we dug a well. And he said, I still have the first table I made. And I'm wondering which one that is. There's some handmade tables out in the barn, so one of those must be his. And I also found the original trunk that he brought from Sweden. That's out in the barn. And Gustav says that first year we bought a yoke of oxen and milk cow. And lived on the place 8 years before I married my neighbor Clara Blades. And Gustav says our social activities were limited. We attended church in Edmond. So that was it. That was their social activity. And he says that we helped our neighbors to harvest grain in the fall, and they helped us. And then we'd have a big dinner when everything was finished. We always had plenty of wild game and fish. I worked hard for what I have, and I'm still living on the homestead.
Well, like a very good note to end on, don't you?
Yeah.
You've worked hard and you're still living on the homestead.
Still trying to keep it going.
Well, we appreciate you very much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
today.
It's
been
fun. It's fun to kind of continue the tradition.